He killed 2 federal agents in minutes. Then he died in a stolen government car. America called him Babyface. On November 27, 1934, outside Barrington, Illinois, Lester Gillis turned a highway chase into one of the bloodiest encounters of the Depression-era crime war. He was 25 years old. He was 5 feet 4 inches tall. And after the gunfire stopped, 2 federal agents were dying. Gillis was critically wounded, and the man known as Babyface Nelson was running out of road. If you know the movie Public Enemies, you know the face. Small, young-looking, unstable. A man with a machine gun and no visible fear. Hollywood gave you the image. The real history gives you something worse. Lester Gillis was not just John Dillinger's reckless sidekick. He was a prison escapee, a veteran car thief, a bootlegging gunman, and the killer of 3 federal agents. Even inside a criminal world built on violence, Nelson had a reputation for being too volatile, too reckless, and too dangerous to control. This is the real story of Babyface Nelson, the Chicago kid who learned that violence could open doors, the fugitive who joined America's most famous bank robbers, and the man who discovered that every escape route eventually becomes a dead end. The question is not whether he was violent. The record is clear on that. The question is why the smallest man in the gang became the one everybody feared. Lester Gillis was born in Chicago on December 6, 1908. He grew up in a city built on factories, railroads, stockyards, politics, vice, and opportunity. Chicago could make a working man rich. It could also teach a young boy that stealing a car paid faster than working in a shop. By his early teens, Gillis was already moving with juvenile street gangs. At 14, he was an accomplished car thief. His appearance gave him the nickname Babyface. He looked younger than his age. Round features, boyish expression, the kind of face that made adults underestimate him. That was the first advantage he ever had. A stolen car was more than transportation in Chicago's criminal world. It was a job. It was an escape plan. It was a way to move liquor, weapons, stolen property, or people across the city without asking permission from anyone. Gillis learned the basics early. Which streets had patrols? Which garages would ask fewer questions? How long it took for police to respond? How quickly an ordinary vehicle could become evidence? In 1922, he was convicted of auto theft and committed to a boys' home. 2 years later, he was paroled. Within 5 months, he was back in trouble on another similar charge. That pattern matters. Prison did not reform him. It taught him the rhythm of the system. Arrest, confinement, release, return. Over the next years, Gillis moved through the criminal economy created by Prohibition. He stole tires. He ran stills. He participated in bootlegging. He committed armed robberies. Every racket required a different skill. Bootlegging meant routes, drivers, storage space, and protection. Robbery meant nerve, timing, weapons, and silence. The opportunity was obvious. Prohibition had made alcohol illegal, but it had not made people stop drinking. That created an enormous market. The inside connections were local drivers, garage owners, liquor runners, and criminals who knew how to move goods through Chicago. The execution depended on speed and intimidation. The money came in cash. And the problem was always the same. Every job produced witnesses. Every witness produced descriptions. Every description made the young man with the harmless face easier to find. In 1928, Gillis married Helen Wazenak, a salesgirl. She became Helen Gillis and kept that name through their marriage. That is one of the details that complicates every clean gangster legend. Nelson had a wife. He had a home life. He had someone who knew him before the newspapers turned him into a public enemy. But a wife at home does not soften the facts. It sharpens the contradiction. By January 1931, Gillis had crossed into major trouble. He was convicted of a Chicago bank robbery and sentenced to 1 year to life. The state sent him to the Illinois State Penitentiary at Joliet. A sentence like that should have been the end of the story. Instead, it became the beginning of the fugitive years. After about a year in custody, Gillis was taken from Joliet to face another bank robbery charge in Wheaton. On February 17, 1932, he escaped from prison guards while being returned to Joliet. He did not need to defeat prison walls. He exploited transit. That is a lesson every experienced criminal understood. A prison has gates, locks, towers, and routines. A prisoner being transported has fewer barriers and more uncertainty. Gillis found the weaker point and escaped through it. Now he could not live as Lester Gillis anymore. He needed aliases, temporary rooms, stolen vehicles, friends who would not ask questions. He went through Reno, Nevada, then headed west to Sausalito, California. That is where he met John Paul Chase. John Paul Chase was different from Nelson. Chase had worked ranch jobs near San Rafael. He had worked in railway shops, first as an office boy and later as a machinist's apprentice. He had attended school only through 5th grade, but he understood engines, routes, work, and silence. By 1930, he was involved with a liquor smuggling operation connected to underworld figures. When Nelson reached California, Chase was still involved in the liquor operation. Nelson worked as an armed guard on the truck used to move illegal liquor. The formula was simple. A driver moved the shipment. The criminal network provided the route and destination. Nelson provided the threat. The money came from a product people wanted but the law prohibited. The danger came from rival crews, police, hijackers, and betrayal. Chase became Nelson's closest associate. He sometimes introduced him as a half-brother. That cover story did more than hide identity. It created the appearance of family. In a world where almost everyone could betray you, borrowed family could become a survival tool. Nelson remained in California with Helen Gillis until May 1933. Then he went to Long Beach, Indiana, where he met figures connected to the criminal network around Homer Van Meter. Van Meter would later become one of the better-known members of the Dillinger Gang. At this point, it is important to separate the real timeline from the movie mythology. John Dillinger's crew was already making national headlines in 1933. On June 10th, Dillinger robbed a bank in New Carlisle, Ohio, taking $10,600. On October 23rd, the Dillinger Gang robbed the Central National Bank in Greencastle, Indiana, taking $75,000. Babyface Nelson was not part of those 1933 Dillinger operations. Dillinger was building his name in the Midwest. Nelson was still moving through his own network, using his own aliases, and deepening his bond with John Paul Chase. Their stories would collide later. The fact that they were not initially the same crew makes the eventual partnership more important. In December 1933, Nelson contacted Chase again. They spent much of the following year together. Their lives became a chain of temporary stops: Minneapolis, Bremerton, Reno, Chicago, California. They traveled constantly because staying still was dangerous. During that period, a man was shot and killed in Minneapolis. The people responsible were reportedly traveling in a vehicle with California license plates that were later traced to a car owned by Nelson. After a trip to Bremerton, Nelson and Chase went to Reno. Chase later said that Nelson killed a man during an altercation there. The victim was a material witness in a United States mail fraud case. The details of every killing in that fugitive period are not equally documented. But the larger fact is clear. By the time Nelson entered the Dillinger orbit, he was not merely a thief with a gun. He was a violent fugitive with a growing record and a trusted criminal partner. In April 1934, Nelson, Helen Gillis, and Chase went to Chicago. Nelson joined the Dillinger Gang. Chase remained in Chicago while Nelson and Helen went with the Dillinger Group to Little Bohemia Lodge in northern Wisconsin. For Nelson, this was the major league. Dillinger had become a national obsession. He had escaped from jail. He had robbed banks in broad daylight. He had become a symbol of the Depression-era outlaw. Some people looked at him and saw a folk hero. Law enforcement saw something more practical: a mobile criminal crew that could cross state lines, rob banks, steal cars, and disappear before local departments coordinated a response. The gang's method was built around speed. They targeted banks where they believed cash could be reached quickly. They used stolen vehicles because the first car could be abandoned after the robbery. They carried serious weapons to overwhelm local resistance. They planned for minutes, not hours. The opportunity was the uneven strength of local law enforcement. The inside connection was accumulated experience, criminals who knew vehicles, routes, weapons, timing, and where to find safe houses. The execution was brutally simple. Enter fast, control the room, take the cash, leave before the town understood what had happened. The money was immediate. The consequences were not. Every major score increased publicity. Every headline brought more law enforcement pressure. Every stolen car became a possible lead. Every gunfight made the crew easier to identify. At Little Bohemia, the illusion of safety collapsed. The lodge was supposed to be a hideout. Woods, roads, distance from Chicago, a place where the gang could rest. But any hideout has one permanent weakness. Other people know you are there. On April 22, 1934, Division of Investigation agents learned the gang's location and moved toward the lodge. Their plan was to surround the property before the fugitives could react. Then the dogs started barking. That sound changed the night. The gangsters understood that something was wrong and escaped into the darkness. The federal operation went badly. Agents accidentally shot and killed a tavern customer and wounded 2 other civilians. Dillinger got away. Nelson did not take the cleanest route out. He ran to a nearby home, forced his way inside, and took 2 people hostage. Shortly afterward, Special Agents J.C. Newman and W. Carter Baum arrived with a local constable. Nelson rushed their car and ordered the occupants out. Before they could comply, he opened fire. Baum was killed. Newman and the constable were wounded. That was the moment Nelson stopped being primarily a bank robber in the public imagination. He had killed a federal agent. The Division of Investigation had lost one of its own. The pressure on him became more personal, more organized, and more relentless. The movie Public Enemies captures Nelson's volatility. That part has a historical basis. But volatility in a criminal crew is not just style. It is a liability. Bank robbers survive through timing, planning, and escape. Nelson had a habit of turning encounters into firefights. Every unnecessary shot created a new victim, a new witness, and a new reason for law enforcement to hunt him. Within a short time, Chase rejoined Nelson. Helen Gillis, who had been released on parole, met them about a month later. They stayed near Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, for several days. On June 23, 1934, Attorney General Homer S. Cummings offered a reward relating to Nelson's capture or information leading to his arrest. The same day, the Justice Department offered $10,000 for Dillinger's arrest and $5,000 for information leading to Dillinger's arrest. The government was making a public statement. These men were not local criminals anymore. They were national targets. 1 week later, on June 30th, 1934, Nelson, Dillinger, and Homer Van Meter participated in the robbery of Merchants National Bank in South Bend, Indiana. The gang took about $30,000. A police officer was shot and killed. The robbery followed the classic pattern. The opportunity was a bank with accessible cash and a town that could not instantly block every road. The gang's inside advantage was experience. They knew how to use stolen cars, weapons, intimidation, and speed. The execution depended on overwhelming the bank before anyone could organize resistance. But the problem was that the gang had become too famous. By the summer of 1934, a robbery connected to Dillinger or Nelson was no longer just a local crime. It became national news. Police departments watched the roads. Newspapers printed photographs. The federal government was gaining more authority. The old system that criminals had exploited was changing around them. After South Bend, the gang fled to Chicago. Later, 2 police officers approached a gang meeting place on Wolf Road outside the city. Nelson opened fire. Both officers were shot. That incident revealed the difference between Nelson and the mythology built around him. He was not merely responding to a dramatic moment. He was creating more enemies at a time when he needed fewer. On July 22, 1934, Dillinger was shot and killed by Division of Investigation agents outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago. He was 31 years old. For the public, Dillinger's death felt like the end of this story. It was not. For Nelson, it meant the country's most famous outlaw was gone. The largest distraction had disappeared. Now the attention shifted toward the smaller man with the young face and the growing body count. Nelson, Helen Gillis, Chase, and 2 associates left Chicago for California. That summer, Nelson and Chase repeatedly traveled between Chicago and California. They were trying to stay unpredictable. But constant movement creates its own vulnerability. On one occasion, they were stopped for speeding in a small town. They paid a $5 fine at the police station and were released. Their car contained machine guns, rifles, and ammunition. It was not searched. $5. That was the price of one of America's most wanted fugitives, slipping through a local police encounter. It does not prove Nelson was a master criminal. It proves the law enforcement system still had gaps. Federal agencies, local departments, sheriffs, and state authorities did not share information with modern speed. A fugitive could cross a state line before a photograph, a fingerprint, or a bulletin caught up. The government was trying to close that gap. On May 18, 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt signed legislation giving the federal government more power to fight crime. On June 18th, Division of Investigation agents received full arrest powers and permission to carry firearms without special authorization. On July 1st, 1935, months after Nelson's death, the Division of Investigation would become the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nelson lived at the end of the old era. He made his name in the spaces between city police, county sheriffs, state borders, and weak communication. By 1934, those spaces were shrinking. In late August, Nelson and the group returned to Chicago. Within a month, Nelson went to Nevada, and Chase traveled to New York City. They reunited near Minden, Nevada, on October 10, 1934. Then they returned toward Chicago. On November 26th, Nelson and Chase stole a car in Chicago and drove toward Wisconsin. The next day, Inspector Samuel P. Cowley received word that Nelson had been seen driving the stolen vehicle near Barrington, Illinois. 2 federal agents spotted the car. Nelson turned around and came up behind them. Chase fired 5 rounds from an automatic rifle into the agent's vehicle. One agent returned fire. A bullet hit the radiator of Nelson's car, partially disabling it. That mechanical failure changed everything. The stolen car was their protection. It gave them speed, distance, and the chance to choose the next road. A damaged radiator meant their escape was now on borrowed time. Cowley and Special Agent Herman Edward Hollis approached in another automobile and began pursuing Nelson and Chase. Near the entrance to Northside Park in Barrington, Nelson veered off Northwest Highway and stopped. Then the final fight began. Before Cowley and Hollis could fully get out of their car, Nelson and Chase opened fire with automatic weapons. The battle lasted only 4 or 5 minutes. Hollis was killed. Cowley was mortally wounded. He would die early the next morning. Nelson was also critically wounded. This was not a clean movie ending. No crowd watched. No newspaper photographer caught the moment. It was road dust, damaged vehicles, automatic weapons, wounded men, and a desperate escape. Chase helped Nelson into Cowley's government vehicle. They moved guns and other items from Nelson's car into the agent's car. Helen Gillis, who had been lying in a field during the battle, got into the vehicle as Chase drove away. Nelson died about 8 that evening. The next day, after an anonymous telephone call, federal agents found his body near a cemetery in Niles Center, Illinois, now known as Skokie. Babyface Nelson was 25 years old. The aftermath was not glamorous. Helen Gillis was arrested on November 29, 1934. For violating parole, she received 1 year and 1 day at the Women's Federal Reformatory in Milan, Michigan. Chase returned to Chicago. On November 30th, he answered a want ad seeking men to drive automobiles to Seattle. He needed a chauffeur's license, and was photographed at a police station. That photograph became important because Chase had not previously been the kind of criminal whose face appeared widely on wanted circulars. Federal agents traced his former employers and associates in California. On December 27, 1934, Chase tried to borrow money from workers at fish hatcheries near Mount Shasta, where he had once worked. They alerted authorities. Chief of Police A.L. Roberts arrested him. Chase was brought to Chicago on December 31st. His trial began on March 18, 1935. 1 week later, a jury found him guilty of murdering Inspector Samuel P. Cowley. He was sent to Alcatraz on March 31st, 1935. He was later transferred to Leavenworth. He was paroled on October 31st, 1966, and died of cancer in Palo Alto, California, on October 5th, 1973. That is the real legacy of Babyface Nelson. Not a criminal empire, not a hidden fortune, not a romantic outlaw ending. A dead federal agent at Little Bohemia, 2 more federal agents shot at Barrington, a widow sent to prison, a partner who spent decades behind bars, and a body left near a cemetery after one last escape failed. Public Enemies gets several essential details right. Babyface Nelson was real. He ran with John Dillinger and Homer Van Meter. He was small, boyish-looking, and known for sudden violence. The real Little Bohemia raid did collapse after the gang was alerted. Nelson did kill Special Agent W. Carter Baum, and he did die after a gunfight near Barrington in November 1934. But the film compresses a longer and more complicated reality. Nelson was not simply Dillinger's unstable side character. He had escaped custody years earlier, developed his own criminal partnership with John Paul Chase, and entered the Dillinger orbit only after building a violent record of his own. The Barrington finale was also more chaotic than a simple final showdown. Chase fired on federal agents during the pursuit. Nelson's car was damaged. Hollis died at the scene. Cowley died the following morning. Nelson was carried away and died later that evening. The largest distortion is not a single scene. It is the scale of Nelson's independence. Hollywood presents him inside Dillinger's story. The documented record shows that Babyface Nelson became a national threat in his own right. Power built on fear always creates the same ending. Eventually, everybody close enough to help you is also trying to survive you. Subscribe for more real stories from the criminal underworld, and tell me which figure should be covered next, the movie myth or the documented man.